Shin Megami Tensei V is Persona without the heart. An infamous take by an IGN reviewer that engendered harassment, and more distressingly transphobia, from a disgruntled fanbase who are often on the receiving end of similar nonsense takes by mainstream reviewers who don't engage with a work on its own merits, so much as whether or not it is akin to Persona. I was one of many guilty of initially believing this to be a bad take. Just another Persona fan expecting SMT to be Persona rather than its own thing. And after decades of this sentiment being essentially synonymous with criticism directed at SMT, this wording without the context of the game would be destined to enrage and then disappear into the endless ether of similar bad takes. Or it would have been had it not been attached to SMT 5. A game where this descriptor, Persona without the heart, is extremely apt because much like SMT 4 Apocalypse before it and Soul Hackers 2 after it, this is a game desperately trying to be like Persona, or is at least more interested in appealing to that lucrative adjacent fanbase as opposed to trying to be a Shin Megami Tensei game. One comment that I got when I first mentioned this sentiment of mine disagreed with it and stated that it was more Team Maniacs being bad at writing, and that if anything, SMT5 was trying to be like Nocturne. While both of these are fair points to make and not things that I deny as components to the lack of quality in the final product, the attempt to recapture the quote, profound charm of Nocturne does not make the other issues inherent within this game the result of that intention. In fact, many issues are specifically disassociated from any connection to Nocturne and owe themselves to other influences entirely. I want to stress this because I do not blame Persona for how bad SMT5 turned out. I blame Team Maniacs for trend-chasing an adjacent franchise's success without the judgment to understand why something can and does work in Persona, but won't in SMT, as that more than anything else is what makes SMT5 Persona without the heart. In fact, my response to this comment, which is the core thesis for this video, was that if the influence of one franchise over another, or at least if the similarities between them are apparent and done in service of a similar goal, then it is entirely fair to examine them and where they fail or succeed and why. A lot of quirks in design decisions, both prominent and subtle, feel like they were done in the manner that they are because this is how they would have been done in Persona previously, or would have been done had this been a Persona game. The reason why this is a bad idea in concept is because SMT and Persona have radically different foundations, and the distinctions between them were made to serve the intents of what each series needed in order to tell the stories that the games wanted to tell. One cannot take a Persona template and try and force an SMT game to conform to this standard because by its very nature, this causes SMT to lose core components of itself in this transition, making games that lack what made SMT so engaging and unique in terms of narrative. This is why I say that SMT5's failures exist at a foundational level and are more complicated and multifaceted than just a Persona influence. However, I still believe that this is the best place to begin the analysis because of the context these games offer through their contrasts and narrative goals, highlighting the disconnect felt between older and more recent SMT games, and pinpointing the reasons why they failed to hold up to what came before. I am Balao-kun, and this is why SMT5 is Persona without the heart. In order to explain the failings of this game, why it is Persona without the heart, we need to explain the foundation of SMT, what makes it so interesting and engaging, and why so many of SMT5's design decisions are at odds with it. SMT is an unapologetically political series whose first entry was social commentary on broader Japanese society, and the alignments reflected real anxieties, perspectives, and cultural shifts of the 80s and 90s. SMT was about something. And while future installments were not as explicit in this commentary, shifting the alignment spectrum to be a separate spectrum of ethics rather than conventional politics, this never changed that the point of the post-apocalypse setting was to explore how and why society can collapse due to real-world systemic issues. The rise of theocratic fascism and the loss of Japan's cultural identity to foreign powers and ideas. The destruction of the environment for convenience and the toxic potential of our modern capitalist society. technology overtaking society to the point of being a source of over-reliance, welcoming in corruption and rule to an elite class who controls said technology, and mortal men playing God, abandoning all ethics in the process. For all my problems of SMT4 Apocalypse, at the very least it had a theme and showcased an interesting and unique angle in how the discontent of an opposition can be unwittingly tricked into subservience within a system through deceit and obfuscation of the whole picture. The game might fumble in exploring controlled opposition, not really understanding the subject matter beyond a basic comprehension, and relegating all potential to how it can and would relate back to and affect each alignment on multiple levels, to merely simplifying its existence contextually as a reason to go neutral, but at least it was an interesting idea, a fresh idea not really explored previously. The same cannot be said for SMT5, which is very much devoid of anything to say or explore in terms of themes or commentary. Something made all the more, for lack of a better word, impressive, given how thoroughly this game is dedicated to trying and invoke previous games. In an interview, producer Kazuyuki Yamai-san, who has since been replaced for the upcoming re-release of Shinjiro Takada-san, stated that the game was being made to resonate with modern concerns. But if so, I have to ask why the game is so toothless in its final form. Nuclear weapons and unemployment, two of the major things stressed in said interview, are nowhere to be found in the game even in allegory, despite having a few areas where they could have at least been brought up tangentially. Tokyo, the world of that, is a desert wasteland, but the reasons why are never explained in detail, when a nuclear bomb would have been sufficient an explanation, just as it did in SMT 1 and 4. In all the aforementioned games, the point of the apocalypse, or potential of in the case of Strange Journey, is to comment on what could cause it and why, leading of course to the question of what caused the apocalypse in SMT5. The answer is a bit obtuse, but from what I can gather, the intended cause is a clash between extremist factions of chaos and law, with Tokyo as a casualty. Which is an answer and a fair one, but it's also one not commented on or thematically relevant to the game, or really brought up beyond a passing detail easy to miss. The apocalypse is done and dusted. The exact mechanics of how it happened are not disclosed, only alluded to vaguely, as is the reconstruction of Tokyo by the God of Law, and as a result, this leads to a dissonance between setting and story. This duality brings up the potential to comment on an interesting idea, the idea of a parallel between two Tokyos, how one is the destroyed remains and the other is a thriving but flawed recreation of, opening up the possibility of exploring whatever caused the destruction of one to be inevitable in the second. History repeating itself because core issues that caused the apocalypse are not resolved, a recurring downside to the neutral alignment that is in long need of being elaborated on. After all, why else have an apocalyptic setting that is not an apocalyptic setting? The answer is Persona. The original Tokyo is treated like a parallel realm of existence, more akin to the world of cognition or Iwatodai amidst the dark hour than that of a genuinely destroyed city. In fairness, this is somewhat closer in conception to the dark realm from Devil Summoner Raido Kuzunoha, but in execution it is unmistakably Persona, creating a duality between the world of ruin and the world of the living, rather than a separation of the two. In Raido Kuzunoha, the Dark Realm is an adjacent realm like Persona, but it represents a hidden darkness, the demons beneath the shadows of man, interfering and conspiring for reasons yet unseen. It is palpable within the narrative as a convenience to dispose of unwanted hindrances and or witnesses, but it is never the focus or the main setting. The main setting is the capital, alive with people and their anxieties as they go about their own days, some in ignorance and others aware, but all affected by the secret supernatural presence in some way. Dot is meanwhile the focus for most of the game. Almost every story-relevant cutscene and event happens in the demon-infested ruins, whereas barely any time is spent in the new Tokyo, most of which is unexplored beyond a map, and what little there is feels inconsequential. By making this the focus, it makes the new Tokyo feel like an afterthought, irrelevant for most of the game despite eventually becoming the emotional crux for the Myriad Gods ending, as Yuzuru sides with Tsukuyomi in order to save the city. And by both being so disassociated and unrelated to the intact Tokyo, this dynamic, instead of adding to the game's narrative, detracts from it. The destruction of the new Tokyo has nothing to do with what had caused the apocalypse, the details of which are never revealed, and instead New Tokyo is slowly fading from existence because God is dead. As a result, New Tokyo feels like a safety net that keeps the stakes low while trying to sell them as being high, akin to a classic death fake-out that serves to retroactively eliminate the emotional investment of a scene. By contrast to this, in SMT4 we know exactly what caused the apocalypse, and while a few key details are kept unclear, what is established is enough, as is the motivation by the angels who seek to finish the job and why. Time is spent in both the Eastern Kingdom of Mikado and Tokyo, and while it is still uneven, the characterization given to NPCs and the world building and how it later contrasts with Tokyo helps to inform a narrative that has much to say about how society can dehumanize the undesirables and how privileged countries continue to cause and perpetuate the poverty in poor countries. SMT4 may not be the best SMT game, but it is one with a lot of the right pieces in place and clear intent and understanding of the subject matter it wants to tackle. Games post-4, however, have made a concerted effort to focus not on these broader ideas, but instead on the characters, and whenever possible, implement clear and concise persona-likes such as a social simulation, and to focus on a singular theme or perspective about a broader idea, if one is even present. For example, in SMT4 Apocalypse, a lot of 4's ideas were retconned to fit the game's core thesis of using persona-empowered bonds to reach an idealized neutrality. The social commentary of actual systemic issues keeping the global self impoverished is replaced with a wishy-washy sermon of middle ground is the best, and that it is actually the oppressed's fault for not going neutral when they had the chance. The same thing happened in SMT5, and is at both its best and worst in the game's second major arc, the arc that arguably had the most amount of potential within the game. Sahori is a girl at the protagonist's school who is bullied, and her vulnerability is possessed by the demon Lamu, who then manipulates her to take revenge and kill her abusers. This isn't a terrible idea for a plot within an SMT game. Begin small and examine a seemingly mundane but relatable situation within a controlled environment like school as a microcosm for wider Japanese society, and how things can escalate from here if not addressed. Sahori is a character beaten down and robbed of her personal freedom from her conformity to the system, and fear of making it worse on herself should she rebel like the Phantom Thieves did. Something that would have also made her a much more compelling representative for the Chaos alignment than Yuzuru was, given that she perfectly represents the perspective of an oppressed individual in a lawful system, paralleling Persona 5's Jungian exploration of chaos. The problem is that isn't Sahori's story, and rather than the highs that could have been, Arc 2 is instead a showcase of the lows that this game sinks to, while emptily emulating previous ideas without regard for how they were implemented or any critical analysis in these concepts, only a superficial acknowledgement of them at best. Firstly, this arc's emotional core is very dependent on Sahori, a character who was only introduced at the start of this arc and who is only just beginning to be fleshed out by the narrative when kidnapped. The player's investment in saving her is therefore based upon her potential within the narrative over anything else, and so when she dies at the end it comes across as hollow on a narrative level, and the game is tone deaf on that matter. This was the moment when I mentally checked out of the game's story, as I became so disassociated with the protagonist's actions that I couldn't control, and disappointed in the narrative that I had to put the game down, and realized in my despair that though it was shamelessly wearing the aesthetic of youth concerns in the same way that Persona does, it would not actually address or even acknowledge them beyond this. The saddest part is perhaps Sahori actually fares the best out of all the youth characters, as besides her, only Dazai has anything resembling an arc. Yuzuru and his sister barely exist and have no development, while Tao dies, only to be resurrected later as a plot point, but with the strange tidbit that she apparently lost her whole personality, showcasing just how mediocre the writing for her was, especially after her resurrection. At least she showed emotion during Arc 2, but when a generic goddess, she literally supports the protagonist no matter what alignment or decision made, save to destroy the throne where one would expect a conflict of interest to lead to battle, but she instead just leaves. The second core issue is also Sahori proper, and more prominently the parallels that she possesses to Persona 5's Phantom Thieves. I want to stress that the similarities by themselves are not the issue. The issue is the implementation. In Persona 5, the Phantom Thieves are a collective of misfits who either don't fit in or only superficially do, while facing harsh discrimination by those who have already decided who they are without bothering to truly know them as people. Their lives and the lives of many confidants are at the whim of others within a systemic power and influenced by society's prejudice, or more specifically the roles that others have assigned to them within the system, and it was through the liberation of their own egos from this conformity that they could muster the courage to rebel. And Sahori is much the same before a negative influence enters her life and manipulates her to embrace chaos so as to take revenge. While the scene is a strong parallel to the chaotic awakenings of Persona 5, the actual context is an attempt to subvert this by being an instance of becoming codependent on a demonic influence, rather than experiencing a moment of liberation and obtaining self-empowerment through acknowledging the unfairness of a lawful society and embracing chaos to overcome it. While this could have been an interesting way to make use of callbacks to subvert the familiar and thus explore an older idea through a new angle, because Sahori dies before accomplishing much beyond her revenge, nothing can really be inferred beyond the subversive nature of a single scene and its implications beyond. This is why I say that this game is Persona without the heart, because it is an SMT game trying to be a Persona game, but without regards to how either series works. Persona is very character-driven and explores the psychology of the teenage cast in ways that feel relevant to the time period that the games are set in. But SMT is about how the world can end and why. While they may not be mutually exclusive concepts, they are in conflict as they were executed, and by shifting the focus, it means that SMT5 cannot make a broader societal commentary without focusing arbitrarily on a singular perspective that becomes the only one of worth, which as a consequence becomes the stance of the game proper, further limiting the scope that it can explore these concepts, which is most felt in the alignments. And as the alignment system is a spectrum of broad ideas, this makes the implementation of it feel either incredibly biased or imprecise, and haphazardly forced in during the final arc depending on which alignment. This was bad enough in SMT4 Apocalypse and Soul Hackers 2, but all perspectives given at least tangentially related to a singular angle to explore the broader ideas in both games. However, SMT5 wants to cover multiple ideas that barely relate to each other or which actively contradict with previous explorations as well as what is actively shown in the same, making the game feel like it is confused on which alignment is what. The worst example being the 4 quests needed to get the true neutral ending, of which only one feels even loosely associated to the reasoning that Nuwa and Yakumo have for erasing all gods and demons from existence. Never mind the fact that the bad neutral ending is somehow a neutral ending at all, when it heavily resembles a fan-favorite chaos ending in the true demon one of Nocturne. Having more personal perspectives for the chaos alignment worked in Persona 5, because Persona 5 is more rooted in exploring this singular alignment from a perspective of psychology that is compatible with the perspective shown. All of which were rooted in recurring details of the characters being systematically oppressed by no fault of their own, by a society that fetishizes law and order, and paralleling each other by rising to the occasion to overcome their specific circumstances, regardless of the prejudices against them as people and the dismissing of their struggles. Sahori's storyline is a retread of Persona 5's exploration, and as a consequence, this basic concept that places the demons of chaos as generic villains becomes the game's perspective on chaos uncritically for Arc 2 and carrying over without any attempt to elaborate or expand upon in Arc 3. This creates a bias for chaos to be generic evil, the very same thing that the developers of SMT1 wanted to move away from when making the alignments of the series in the first place, and in contrast to the intended chaos ending, wherein myriad gods are allowed to coexist, contrasting the self-destructive selfishness, predatory arrogance, anarcho-capitalism, and the disregard for the well-being of others which had defined the alignment previously. Law and neutrality are similarly rooted in wholly insular perspectives that the game makes no real attempt to challenge or elaborate on, and with the ideologies and logic for someone to arrive at their conclusions being either absent or left to infer from the context of the alignment's portrayal in previous games. Going back to Chaos, the Myriad Gods ending does have parallels to the Chaos ending of SMT2, restoring the spiritual powers of the banished gods, including those of the Amatsukami, but in the context of SMT5, feels closer to neutrality because it is a middle ground between the concentration and dissolution of the power and the right to recreate the world into one god and destroy the throne endings. That said, the Sahori storyline and its implications is not where the Persona parallels and particulars end, as this game conforms to Persona in another major way. The depiction of deities, and like with the broader ideas, this comes at the cost of contradicting both itself in isolation and what it is trying to invoke as familiar. In Persona, demons, broadly speaking, are a metaphysical construct created by the human mind. This is the reason why Persona users have individualized personas, why shadows resemble heroes, monsters, and gods of mythology, and why the antagonist gods born of human cognition are distinct to their instances of mythology, typically only having a thematic correlation to the theme in their associated mythos, as opposed to being the actual character of. In SMT, demons are a more spiritual existence. Similar to Persona, they are a stagnant existence who do not change like humans do, yes, but their point of origin is unmistakably supernatural and exist independent of the human experience and condition. Rather than being born of the collective unconscious, the great will, the primordial chaos from which all divine, demonic, and mortal originated from, created demons and deities just as it created humans. To put it another way, the deities of Persona are manifestations of faults in the human condition because our own interpretation of our own existence is flawed by virtue of being human, whereas the deities of SMT are the deities of mythology, the very ones worshipped in times of old. To be clear, Persona's interpretation of demons in the lore is merely a more literal take on SMT's thematic angle, in representing the mythologies of old as allegories and parallels to the modern day, but the context to why this is the case and works in Persona, and why this isn't the case in most SMT games, is crucial to understanding a core difference between Persona and SMT. Perhaps the best parallel to showcase this contrast is in the staple Abrahamic god YHVH and Persona 5's god who invokes much the same, Yaldabaoth, who is an interpretation of the Christian god as a malevolent figure in Gnostic spiritual beliefs but is differentiated from YHVH in the context of the respective game series. Yaldabaoth is the uncritical desire to be controlled, to shirk the responsibilities of freedom and instead be guided and controlled because it is easier than to truly embrace and live life to its fullest. This is in direct contrast to YHVH, who genuinely believes in the ideology of law as something in service to the greater good. For all his faults, YHVH can be said to be offering salvation and protection to the people and the peace that they enjoy. The people of Mikado enjoy a life of privilege in never knowing the war and poverty of Tokyo, and while the system that upholds this status quo is unfair and unjust to those who do not perfectly conform, to those that do, it offers them and their loved ones the benefits promised. With that clarified, I'd like to now look at the interpretation of demons in SMT5 via Aogami, who is the most clear and prominent example of a deity representing and being written in the more Persona angle of interpreting demons and deities within this game. Aogami is Susanoo, the Shinto god of storms known for his violent temper, general spite to those who wrong him, but also a willingness to help others without a clear benefit, and acknowledges when he is in the wrong. Susanoo in mythology is emotional and moody, as much so as the storms he is believed to invoke, but not without a sense of empathy, taking pity and saving Kushinada Hime from Yamata no Orochi. By contrast to this, in SMT5, Aogami is largely bland and stoic. His personality is that of a stereotypical robot until interactions with the protagonist cause him to develop and conform to the opinions and feelings of the human who bears his knowledge. He is the most literal and obvious example of the Persona concept of a human's cognition giving rise to a deity representing their perspective, but with the caveat of not having any thematic parallel to his mythology. I'm not sure if this is a hot take or not, but I personally felt that Aogami would have been a better silent protagonist, given that he begins the game devoid of a personality, whereas the protagonist displays emotions despite him being intended to be silent, and is canonically the one in control of combat and movement by the lore of the game, akin to how Namisa was in control of Hitomi's body in Devil Summoner Soul Hackers. And given the emphasis on knowledge and him forming his own opinions on things as they occur, Aogami would have made a better POV than the character who already had pre-existing relationships and a personality. While Aogami and the aforementioned Lamu are the most prominent examples of this Persona-style writing of gods, this approach is present in all major deities within the game by design. Tsukuyomi is an abstract god of the moon turned political figure who desires to see a return to polytheism. Nua is the humanity-first uncritical perspective of neutrality even to her own detriment, and Abdiel, while the deity with the most character, is nevertheless the uncritical devotion to a higher power that Dazai embodies by the end of the game, having previously taken the form of that perspective as an authority within Bethel. This trend is an issue as it erases the spiritual aspect of SMT, the core conceit that gods and demons are real and fight for their ideals in an endless conflict, that parallel wars waged by mankind, often with similar ideals playing a role in one's place in the conflict. Granted, this may have been intentional given the concept of knowledge as well as the character development of Aogami and Abdiel which arises, or is at least influenced by the holders of their knowledge, but if so, why are these deities largely unconnected, even at odds with their mythological origins? Lamu are benevolent protectors, and thus his position as Sahori's parasite could have been replaced by any major deity such as Pazuzu, who would have fit the story more given the parallel between narrative and mythology, as a destructive wind god who may still find it within him to protect people from his rival Lamashtu. But even if so, this does not change the core issue of the mythological being a subservient caste to the human interpretation of. This is the most problematic Persona parallel that SMT5 has because it directly bogs down the story, characters, alignments, and themes, but this is not the cause, but a symptom of this game attempting to appeal to the more lucrative adjacent market of Persona fans. This game has a few other quirks that feel Persona-inspired or adjacent as well, such as the reworking of how buffs work, but I feel like I've made my point, and from the looks of things with Demon Haunts where the protagonist can have social interactions with other characters, I don't think that Persona without the heart will stop being an apt description for this game with a re-release. SMT needs to stop trend-chasing Persona and instead embrace what made it so beloved and unique, rather than try and conform it to the arbitrary standards of its most successful spin-off. Persona is successful, beloved, and acclaimed for many reasons, and I am in no way attempting to discredit said series, as I very much enjoy and like Persona, but for separate reasons to why I enjoy SMT, and see no reason for them to exist independently of each other, and for their own merits to shine through and be praised in spite of any association to an adjacent series. If Atlus wants to make a game that both fanbases like, they need to make a new spin-off from the ground up that can accomplish this without sacrificing the core appeal and heart of each respective series, rather than conform a separate IP to be Persona without the heart or Persona Lite. Especially because these Persona parallels only further cast SMT into the massive shadow of Persona's success, rather than allow it to reach its own audience. As for whether or not this is the direction of future SMT games, we will have to wait and see. Here's hoping for a not terrible 5 Vengeance, and an against all odds good SMT6. Thanks for watching.